So thank you so much for being here today for this exciting conversation, this amazing group of panelists that we have to talk about one of the emerging policy trends that we've been tracking and following at Whiteboard Advisors. I'm Anna Edwards. I'm co-founder and chief advocacy officer at Whiteboard Advisors. We're an education policy research, advocacy, and strategic communications firm in DC, but we're closely tracking and monitoring everything going on around the country. And excited to have here today Derrell Bradford, president of 50CAN, a national education advocacy organization, Aimee Guidera, Secretary of Education for the state of Virginia, Michael Horn, author, multiple-time author, but a new book on reinventing education coming out of the pandemic that everyone should read, and Joe Connor, CEO of Odyssey, an ed tech company that's implementing a number of state ESA programs and other microgrant programs. And last but certainly not least, Emily Ann Gullickson, who's been doing advocacy work on ESAs in Arizona, the largest state-level program currently being implemented of ESAs in the country. So with that, very excited to kick this off. For those of you that have been following ESA and school choice policy, it's been a big couple of years. Since 2021, we've seen 13 states move forward with ESA programs, and 32 states this past session introduced pieces of legislation. So it's clearly a hot topic. We're also seeing states implement microgrant programs for tutoring and other enrichment activities, and leading to a real portfolio approach for students' education, all with the tailwind of parents that are super mobilized and motivated to advocate for their kids' education. So with that, Derrell, I'd love to start it with you, just to kind of set the stage with the context. Coming out of the pandemic, how are parents feeling? How are they feeling about their kids' education? And where do ESAs fit into all of this?
Yeah, so good question. Anna, thank you for making the mistake of having me here. Also, if you've seen any other panel I've been on today, I had red pants on, but these aren't those red pants. So, so thank you. They are those red pants, but whatever. A couple of things, and the polling sort of backs this up, and I wrote a piece about the Youngkin election, not just Youngkin, but Governor Murphy's re-election, which is basically the hypothesis was there was a lot of anxiety for a lot of reasons going on around K-12 education, in the Northeast in particular around school closures, and that there wasn't a chance for the electorate to express its consternation about that until the off-cycle gubernatorial elections of a little over a year ago. And so I also argued that the Virginia election, though surprising, didn't really have the important lesson. The important lesson was New Jersey, because Joe Biden, there are 1 million more registered Democrats in New Jersey than there are Republicans. Joe Biden had run like the year before and gotten 60% of the vote, and it was this close, right? The election was a squeaker, and New Jersey and Virginia were top 10 in school closures, and they are also two states that pride the bundling of housing of your school with your fancy house, right? And the terms of that deal, you guys know I like movies. It's like Vader in Empire, where he says, you know, I've altered the deal, right? And lots of parents were upset about the fact that this covenant that they had been, you know, the terms of that had been altered, and they had their chance to express that, and they did, right? So there was that, and obviously there was learning loss. There's a whole bunch of other stuff, and we had polling, which some of you may have heard about earlier, that said that Americans of all stripes, like Democrats, Republicans, you know, women, men, like young, old, were in favor of big change coming out of the pandemic. Like everybody sort of knew kids were behind. There were lots of other trends that were presenting themselves there, but people didn't want a simple return to the normal, the 2018 normal, the 2019 normal of the system. So I would say, given all of that, there are lots of things that have happened, but the biggest thing is our ESAs, and I'll just like highlight 3 little things I think about them, and then I'll shut up and smarter and better position people can talk with. People who are actually implementing these things instead of just like making up movie references about them. So 3 things I think are happening right now that are incredibly important. So one, the ESA gives you the chance to bundle, which is to say you can invest in your kids' education outside of when you send them to school. And this is something that rich people do all the time, right? And there's a great deal of research that says that there's essentially like an arms race that's been going on for like 30 years, where wealthy parents are investing significantly more in enrichment, tutoring, sports, all of these other things outside of school. And you could argue that that is a deep accelerant to the achievement gap, if the achievement gap is what you care about most. And so one is that some poor folks are going to get the chance to spend the way rich folks do on out-of-school stuff, and that is very exciting to me. On the child tax credit, there was a study about this that said that low-income and minority people we just got started.
So sorry.
That low-income and minority people were more likely to spend money from the child tax credit on education than anybody else. Like, that is a wonderful finding. So I just sort of throw that out there. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that I think there's actually a grand sort of split screen experiment in accountability going on right now. So you think about the last 20 years, whatever, and Aimee knows this well, and Aimee and I, Secretary Guidera knows this well, and we've worked on these policies a long time, but at 50CAN, we're kind of like old school accountability people. We care about annual assessments those policies have driven a lot of change, or at least focus, right, in the discussion around K-12. Education. But in that, it's you have this sort of top-down approach to measurement. You give the parents a little bit of say and not a lot of money, right? So, maybe you have charters, maybe you have something else someplace, there's certainly no direct finance. And right now we have a different take on that right now, where some states are saying, listen, we're gonna give the parents a lot of say. We're gonna align finances to that decision, and we're going to figure out a different way to measure it. And so there are two differences happening in America right now in a way that hasn't happened, at least while I've been doing this. I think that's incredibly exciting in terms of how we figure out what the next new could be, and what works, and how parents know about what works. So that's the second thing. The third and final one is just that I'm incredibly excited about the market mechanism, and I say that explicitly, and I can explain it later if you want to, and its ability to help us fledge the future. I think we're all sort of living in what at this point is a pretty ossified paradigm of how we should deliver education. It values address over aspiration. Most of the devices we use to fledge new things, like charter schools, whatever, and I'm a great supporter of charter schools, we fledge the same thing with them sort of over and over and over again, our tolerance towards risk is lowered, and the amount of people we can have on the problem in terms of educators or whatever is very small, because we've regulated tightly who can be a part of that. And if we're ever gonna take an approach that is of abundance, right, where we can have more people engaged, more people, more places, more institutions engaged in the education of the next generation of Americans, and help families finance that and bring it into existence and sustain it. Now is the most interesting time to do that while I've been doing this. So thanks.
Super helpful context. By the way, the call was from my husband, who had a question about my daughter's homework. So parent engagement at the forefront here. But Aimee, I'm curious, as you've heard Derrell kind of frame up the conversation, we know the governor ran on a campaign of a lot of motivated and engaged parents, and you've launched, I think, a microgrant program now in Virginia. There's an ESA bill going. How does all of this fit together in Virginia?
So is this on? Good. Thank you, Anna, and thanks, Derrell, for setting this up. So, on the campaign trail, and now since we've been in office for the last 15 months, it's just a reminder that parents matter, and that is what you will hear us talk about all the time in Virginia. And I don't say it's a new thing, we're reminding people, because as the governor says all the time, parents should be not just at the table, they should be at the head of the table. And I think that what Virginia tapped into is a reminder that parents need to be a part of education in a way that they haven't been in a very long time. And we are probably not the poster child. I am not the poster child that should be up here talking about ESAs, because we are one of the few places that our ESA bill did not get traction this year. But I am here to tell you that empowering families, the other models piece, is what we're all about. The governor ran on how do we empower families. And I just want to run 3 things through you about what I think about it means to empower families. 3 is the word of the day, the number. Power of 3. So 1, we're all product of our families and our parents, and I'm no other than that. I'm the daughter of an economist, so I was taught that markets work, right? We talked about markets. On the side, my mother is a psychiatric social worker, so we had really interesting conversations around the table, which also have a lot to do with you got to meet people where they are in education, and markets work. So there's some truth in there somewhere. But on the economist side, markets work. And when I think about when we're empowering people to work in this marketplace, and one of my hopes is that we are creating a marketplace within education, because we know the one-size-fits-all monopoly is failing our kids. And I could spend the next hour regaling you with data that we have been putting out in Virginia, making the case that our one-size-fits-all approach and the lack of choices that exist in Virginia are failing kids, and that our achievement caps continue to get large, and our highest achieving kids in this last round of NAEP also prove the point that it's not serving our high achieving kids either. I won't go into that unless you want to know more, but I'm happy to talk to you. Let me just say this. Virginia had the largest learning loss in the nation in 4th grade math and reading. We erased 20 years of progress. We are now below the national average, and that our loss was 3 times greater than the national average, which was already horrific on NAEP. And this is Virginia, which is supposedly the angels sing when we talk about education in Virginia, and we've been getting by on the numbing masking by using averages rather than longitudinal data, and hiding the fact that we have immorally been leaving especially poor Black, Hispanic, and kids with special needs behind, and that's going to stop now because we're going to use data to make the case. So what are we doing differently, and how are we empowering families? There are 3 things that my economist dad talks about all the time. 1, to be able to empower people, you need to make sure that you have quality options. And so everything that we're doing is about how do we make sure that there are quality alternatives to the one-size-fits-all approach. The governor announced on his first week in office, the first event he did was an announcement with all of our higher education institutions announcing lab schools that were going to be sponsored by higher education institutions, working in partnership with our K-12 school divisions and the private sector to build a better mousetrap. How do we make sure that we're building schools and specifically targeted to students for whom the traditional public school is not working, and making sure that you are using evidence and research to build a theory of action about getting different results. So right now, a year into that, we have 21 planning grants and launch. So our goal is to have 20 of these schools launched, and the response has been incredible. What that says to me is that there is an appetite for innovation within our schools and within our systems. People are dying to get better choices, and what we're finding is that teachers want to build better schools, parents want better schools, communities, employers want to be part of building schools that work for kids and work for teachers. So that's 1. 2, we're also in the whole piece when we're thinking about quality options of how do we make sure that we're also providing options to course choice, to career technical education. The governor is going to be rolling out a plan this next session where our expectation is we're going to rethink the last 2 years of high school and make sure that every single graduate of a high school in Virginia make sure that they have an industry recognized credential and or an associate's degree. We believe, again, that more and more students are not having those pathways elucidated. They're not having exposure to the world of work. They're not having the exposure to the world beyond school walls. And so we're doing more and more to say, how do we do a better job of connecting schools with the world outside of schools, and how do we continue to build better options? The second piece is, how do we make sure that we are providing people and empowering families with quality information? And this is something near and dear to me as someone who's spent the last 20 years of her life talking about the power of data to change lives. We, for the first time in Virginia, by June 30th, will be providing to every single parent in the state the same data report that we are providing to every student and to every teacher that tells in clear language, this is where your child is. This is where you are as a student, and here's where you are. And it will clearly say, Aimee cannot read. Aimee is not on track for success. And what we're also building through a pilot program called Bridging the Gap is training for all of our teachers to be able to talk with parents about what that data says and what they're going to do differently. And we're building personalized learning plans for every child who is not on track for success. This is the transformative power of data. And it's data, but just pause for a second. This is news, and it should not be news that parents for the first time are going to get a tailored, timely, actionable snapshot of where their child is. And our commitment is to provide that every single year and to do that. This should not be revolutionary. This should not be transformative, and yet it's going to be. And the other piece we're doing is we're building a parent portal. We had a piece of legislation this last session that just ended, that says we're going to build a state-of-art parent portal to make sure that parents have access to information in a timely way always. And we've also just invested a huge amount of time, energy, and money in building state-of-the-art longitudinal data systems that are going to do not just growth but proficiency. And we're redoing our accreditation system so that it does not continue to tell people that everything is fine. When we don't have just a pause on this one, we have an accreditation system that in which not a single school or division in Virginia is not accredited. And yet, I just told you those data that we had the largest learning loss in the country. And yet, we're still telling parents, everything's groovy here, nothing to look at. And we're lying, basically. And so bottom line, same thing with our proficiency gap, that we have the lowest proficiency definitions in the nation as compared to NAEP's definition of proficiency, and that's called the honesty gap, and people in Virginia are upset when we call that out. And yet the bottom line is we continue to tell people that their kids are able to do things that the data does not back up, and that's what we're changing. That's called empowering people with information that they can use to make improvement. It's not to beat people up. It's not using data as a flashlight. It is about holding people accountable for results and using it for continuous improvement. The third way that we're empowering families is with money, right? Markets don't work without cold, hard cash. And I would argue that you need to have quality options, you need to have quality information, you need to have quality money that actually does something. So a couple things that we did with money. We didn't get ESAs this time, but we are able to use $30 million. We just launched our Learning Recovery Grant Program that we're going to make available to every single family, every single child, $1,500 that can be used now that we're going to give them information on where their child is for enrichment, for tutoring, for programs, and that for families that are at 400% of the poverty level or more, they have $3,000 per child. And we went across the country and said, what is the right amount of money that actually will be worth signing up for, and where you can actually make a difference? And what people said, it has to be more than $1,500. So that's what we did. And we're rolling that out right now. And this is the piece I'm really excited about. When we send out that letter to every parent in the state, we are putting a QR code on there that says, Aimee can't read. Click here and access your $1,500 or your $3,000. We're also starting a marketing campaign to make sure that the majority of those dollars go to families who need it the most. That's actionable information, right? When all of a sudden you tie information with dollars, with opportunities, that's the holy grail of how do we actually get people to act on that. I'll stop there, but bottom line, and then we also have increased our tax credit scholarship. We made a whole deal to really make that be best in the nation. I can talk more about that, and I will stop there, but there's so much going on. But to us, empowering families is not just one program or one approach. It's how do we look very differently about making sure that people have the information, the dollars, and the options that they require and that they deserve as families.
I love that, and it's a totally different level of accountability in many ways. Emily, and on the topic of accountability, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about Arizona's program and the ways that you provide data to parents, 50,000 students, largest ESA implementation in the country. How do you all think about accountability in that context, and what are the lessons learned?
Yeah, great question, and Madam Secretary, very excited to see that underway. So for those of you that weren't paying attention to the ESA when it first launched, this is pre-iPhone, pre-cell phone apps. So let's level set, pen and paper. And so for the first decade, it was really financial accountability, because in the early days, we didn't have all the amazing tech platforms that existed. And so Bank of America had these debit cards, and you were given your amount of money and off you went. And the accountability hawks were really focused on the fact that you would look at receipts on the back end. And now, with the advancement of technology, we have amazing vendors that are able to put some guardrails on the front end so that parents are really empowered with knowing what they're able to access, how they're able to leverage tools and resources, tuition payments instantly, and that they can know that the purchases they're making on the front end will yield, and that they have that runway to go forth. Since we launched the universal ESA, I think it's important to flag for the room that there's a new we leveled up on accountability. It's no longer just finances, but now it's really, are you actually universal? It's like an accessibility accountability, right? And so I'm really proud that in last year's legislation, we included technology, because now isolated, rural, remote students in particular, kids from low-income households can purchase Wi-Fi boosters, can purchase a laptop that you couldn't use because, again, we passed the law and it referenced pen and paper resources back in the day. And so it's a blessing when you go first. You have to keep adapting. But that's a game changer. Transportation was included around an access barrier, because we all know a choice is not a choice if you can't get there. And so that was huge for level setting for our lower income and middle income families, to make sure you could actually get to the vendors that are provided. We've done a ton of vendor awareness. So there's now 3,700 and growing vendors participating in the ESA program in Arizona. And it's no longer just sort of the Scottsdale, Phoenix area, but we're really reaching out statewide. And so is it perfect? No, not yet. There's been a ton of focus on parent groups, making sure that Love Your School, Families Empowered, Padres Unidos, that everyone's getting trained and building awareness with families, because it's a fair question. So it's no longer as much on the finances because the technology is strong. It's now, are we really following through with making sure that every child in Arizona who wants to use the ESA can access it? So it's an exciting new chapter. We went from about 11,000 kids up until it was universal to 52,000 and growing. So every day there's new students. And so the technology has made it so that you can rapidly expand that quickly. If we had had the old infrastructure, humans just could not onboard that many families. And so it's really been a game changer from what sort of the laser focus was on truth and accountability.
Well, I'm going to come back to the question of accountability, because I think there's probably more to say, and potentially more from the audience in terms of questions on that. But Emily, and you mentioned access and the role that technology is playing in kind of the new form of ESA implementation. And Joe, I'm curious if you'd want to pick up on what you're seeing from Idaho and Iowa, where you're implementing these programs. How is technology making a difference and making it easier for parents?
Yeah, absolutely. I think technology is absolutely vital when we talk about implementation. I think it can help make sure that the programs are at capacity. So in our very first state implementation in Idaho, one of the things that we did was run a very targeted marketing campaign. And we were actually able to make sure that we had enough parents to fulfill the grant, but actually even more than that, which then made it easier for the governor to go back and ask for money kind of a full year ahead of schedule. So I think when we're talking about implementation, it's important to remember that there's kind of many facets of it, right? So Emily Ann talked about payments. That's a big part of it. I think also outreach is really important, right? In states that have seen large numbers enroll, it's because they have a very robust system of outreach. There have been other states where that has not been the case. And so one thing that we do at Odyssey that makes us a little different is make sure that we are partnering with nonprofits, with advocacy organizations to get the word out. Other things that I think are very important are, I think, improving upon things like identity verification. So one of the things that we're rolling out in the next few months in Iowa is we will have the ability to instantly verify parents. So the current standard right now is, depending on what state you're in, it can take weeks or days to hear back. And in Iowa, we'll be able to implement for the first time in the country the fact that parents will instantly be able to check that they are eligible for the program. And so I think it's being able to have technological improvements like that that will increase accessibility and increase access for parents to these programs.
Super helpful. Michael, I'm coming back to you in the middle. Since your brand is disruption and innovation, I'm curious to get your take. Do you think that this is truly disruptive? Is it a fad? Are these ESAs and microgrants here to stay? What do you think?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so I think it could enable disruption, right? Like I think and let me come back to that in a moment and first answer the big question, which is I don't think it's a fad, because ESAs have fundamentally reset the relationship between schools and parents. And it has put not just a voucher in the hands, like, you know, Aimee and I used to do a lot in higher ed, talking about why don't families consume data more when they're taking the Pell Grant or federal financial aid to make their choices and pick institutions that are actually more likely to graduate students rather than have the 40+% that don't graduate within 6 years from higher ed. And I think what's different is ESAs start to address that, is they say, you don't just have to spend it on one thing. We're giving you a basket of dollars, and now you have choices to allocate it among a number of different options. Derrell talked about, gee, you can spend it on enrichment activities, you can spend it on tutoring, you can spend it on the core schooling, you can spend it on multiple schooling options to put this together. We know from a lot of the research that's been done in the universal basic income sector, no matter what you think of UBI as a policy, we know that low-income families spend those dollars quite wisely. You trust families to make really good choices when it's in their bank account, and they can make these trade-offs between different choices, particularly when you start to stand up the other part of the market that you were talking about. And so I think that's fundamentally different, the power that that puts in the hands and the accountability that that creates. And when you combine that with the operationalization of it, then you make it work. And so it's really a meaningful set of choices. And so this feels like the sort of thing that gains steam, doesn't lose steam over time, because the more experience people have with it, the more they're going to want of it. And while I think some folks probably think, oh, it's going to unbundle education tomorrow, tons of different providers. I don't know that we're going to see that, but I think over time, as we get experience with it, we might see more and more of those sorts of behaviors. And that could be disruption, right? Because now you're going to get alternative, low-cost, high-value programs in a range of different offerings starting to come into the market with a real demand side. So you talked about making sure the supply side is there. Well, now that we have a demand side looking for more options, that's when we get more customization and innovation in these different sectors. And a lot of us are looking at the world of tutoring and the explosion that's happened in the last few years around that. And we're looking at the cliff coming with ESSER funds and saying, there's going to be a lot of tutoring companies that, maybe have gotten some lofty valuations that can't, maintain those. And yet, if you think about the education savings account market for those, well, all of a sudden parents and students are going to be able to directly opt into those, and that's going to create waves of innovation as well. And I think that it's going to make a lot of this information far more valuable in the hands of consumers, which is just going to create options that we have not seen. And frankly, you can save these dollars and use them toward other things. You can roll them over toward other educational options. So now there's going to be an incentive for the first time to look for those high value opportunities that really create impact for your child.
Yeah, please jump in.
Sorry. So on one point about the demand side of it, so in Minnesota, they made this whole focus on early childhood of providing people with scholarships. And they said, again, in the marketplace, how do we create this marketplace? And they said, we're going to double down on quality, and that we're going to double down on putting real dollars in the hands of families who cannot afford quality. And again, the marketplace, and what people said is, oh, this is only going to help existing ones. We don't have enough people in the demand side to do this. And guess what happened? When all of a sudden people started realizing that you were empowering families with real cash, like $13,000 a year to spend on early childhood, and with real information so that quality, you could only use it on quality, guess what ended up happening in the inner city? Great providers went in and set up their centers in the inner city in the neighborhoods that had been child care deserts. The markets work, right? And when you build a market to work, it happens. And so I think this is just a moment for education at all levels, higher ed, K-12 training, early childhood, to transform. And we do these things. We have better data than we've ever had before. We're starting to decouple the dollar piece and having dollars follow families. It is going to allow an explosion in quality options. And this is an exciting moment.
Yeah. And the other piece of this, right, is quality is going to be defined based on the progress that individual families need. And so a lot of things that we have not seen expressed in options or innovations in the past are going to start to come to fore as we start to see families that actually have needs that have been completely unmet because they've been masked heretofore. And that's going to change. I mean, you're seeing it already.
Yeah,
what you're authorizing.
I was actually going to give an anecdotal example. I know this applies in Arizona too. One really interesting service that we've seen a lot in Idaho is equine therapy. And I think probably you could poll government officials and it wouldn't be in the top 100 things that they think parents care about.
You could poll rich government officials, though, and they would know all about it.
But it's interesting because it's an accepted form of behavioral therapy for adolescents, and we have seen a massive uptake in Idaho since the introduction of the Empowering Parents program of more and more providers coming onto the platform, more and more parents signing up for it. And I think it's a really interesting idea that I think sometimes what we think, we might know best or we know what parents want, right, is something completely different. And so I think that's a really good example of what Michael's talking about.
Your portfolio approach, Derrell. I'm curious, though, we can maybe even roll with that example. In terms of efficacy and then the feedback loop back to accountability, how will we know what programs are actually producing results in this model? Does anybody want to jump in on that?
All right, so I want to go with this one. I'll step on that landmine. So I think there are two things that have to happen at the same time, and they sort of confound one another, but they're really important. The first one is you have to embrace mistakes, right? So we're at the front end of like a fundamental change in how people interact with education, how they put it together, how it's valued, what they prioritize. And when you put like a few million people or a few 100 million people on that, right, some great things are gonna happen, some terrible things are gonna happen, there's gonna be a lot of information, right? We need to take a step back, right? Like we need to let the market emerge before we specify what it's going to be, right? And I just, I'm a notorious charter school supporter. I feel like in the beginning, charter schools are like, hey, here's a device that's gonna let you do all these interesting things in public education. And then 10 years later, people are like, no, you use it to do this, right? Sort of over and over and over again. And that's given us some amazing schools, but those are different things, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing is that in parallel to this, I always call it a market for measurement because I was an English major and I'm bad at math. And that the approach is that, like, except in Virginia, the ritual of annualized assessments is under fire, right? It's under political fire, right? And despite it, only 1 in 5 black fourth graders in this country reads at or above proficient on the NAEP, right? So we have an accountability regime that is at best transparency and at worst unaccountable, right? It's giving us a one-size-fits-all system that works for fewer people than it helps. This is an issue, right? And so to me, what we need is a different way to help parents figure out what is working for them, right? And so this whole question of for whom, like right now we have an accountability transparency framework that is for a state secretary of education, right? Or for an education policy advocate or for someone looking for the right house to buy with the school bundled into it, right? It works really well if you want to do that. Like what we don't have is a system that's going to help a family organize things that are going to work very specifically for their kid and judge whether or not that is working well or not. And that too will come with a few mistakes, but I always call it Strava for education. They figured it out in the health fitness realm, right? Like they've made measurement addictive. Your measurement is addictive, right? And the idea that we can't apply those principles in, to learning in the K-12 space, to me that seems like for these folks, that should be an easier lift.
Emily, do you want to jump in on that? I'm curious to know how you're thinking about consistent measures in Arizona.
Yeah, and I think it's also being led by people on the ground. In Arizona, over 1 in 2 students do not attend their assigned neighborhood district school, and so you have to compete and you have to market yourself. And so some people are sort of self-regulating, and they're leading with, here's our college going rate, or here's our grad rate, or here's our scholarship earn rate per kid if your child attends here. Some of our private schools are doing that. Here's our attrition rate through a 4-year program. Here is the earning value for our graduates upon 6 years out, et cetera. And so you're seeing that with micro schools advertising, here's our growth rate. Here's how much your child can learn in a 6 months or a full year. And so I think you're already starting to see some of those metrics where they're really in tune with the families and communities that they're serving, and that they're really leaning into that. And is it perfect? No, not yet. But we're definitely seeing translations underway as well for some of our more diverse communities, looking into Navajo language and Spanish language translation. But I think it's making sure that families are able to find those partners to be able to go forward and learn. And then you also have, like, our Department of Education has implemented sort of parent help supports from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. and also on the weekends. Why does that matter? Because it's listening so that the times are accessible for all families instead of like this niche 8 to 2. Like, I can't be contacted from 8 to 2, so how would I get to the Department of Ed from 8 to 2, right? And so I think you're also seeing leadership there in making sure everyone has the tools and access to the information.
And I think that's part of it, right? Is that you're going to see a lot of this spring up from a lot of different sources. I predict that Odyssey is going to start to be providing some of this in the future as well, because you're going to start to have a sense of, gee, this family in this circumstance is hiring this educational choice to get this sort of outcome. And they want more and more information to help them navigate that over time. And so you'll see the, frankly, growth-based, I think, assessments on, like, can you read and fundamentals, but you're gonna also see a whole bunch of bespoke metrics that I suspect we can't even think of right now that actually matter to the people on the ground themselves. And in education, and I'm guilty of this as well, but we often want, like, what's the high quality thing? Like, we obsess. And, like, in the real world, though, outside of this, like, is that coffee cup from Starbucks higher quality than this metal cup from, that they handed out? It's a silly question because they're two totally different circumstances in which I use them. If I've got the hot drink that I'm running, I want that one. If I got refillable water, I have this. It's two totally different contexts, and data comes in service of the progress and the circumstance that you're in. And so I think we're going to start to see a lot of new ways to think about quote-unquote quality against what people are actually demanding.
But there's also quality data is defined by timeliness too, and actionable. And so part of this too, like, one of the most damning things I ever heard when I was at the data quality campaign was a mom who found out that her daughter had to do summer school, and it was just after this, and she said, why are you just telling me now in May? There had to have been some indicator that you knew that my child was not keeping up. Why am I hearing it now? And and then you hear the stories from people who graduate and then can't get a job, and like, had you told me I had to take Algebra 2, I would have taken Algebra 2. Like, we are lousy in education and providing people actionable information when they need it. So what I love is Derrell's idea that we should be able to access on our smartwatches, how many minutes did my child read today? Tell me with this, here's the bottom line. We know what it takes to be on track for success. We know it. And in fact, all the data, all the predictive analytics, which I know we don't like to talk about because it sounds scary, we can actually tell you which students are going to be on track for success and which aren't. If we were in the medical profession and we were at a medical conference and doctors had information about my child and they did not tell me that my child was sick or something was wrong, that would be medical malpractice. That is what we are doing right now in education. We have the data, we know which kids are going to be okay, we know which kids aren't, and yet we are not empowering families with that information. That is immoral, it is wrong, and it has to stop.
Mic drop. I love, in our last couple of minutes, I said we'd get to a couple of questions. Does anyone have questions? I certainly have more, but wanted to make sure if anyone had questions in the audience that we got to those as well. Yeah.
Real fast, I've talked too much. There is such a marketplace for this 7,000 people that do this sort of thing to build into of getting actionable data into the hands of people. And please do it for students. This is the piece. How we've transformed behavior is that we're wearing our own data on our watches. I'm old, so I don't. But we are forgetting to communicate directly with our students and providing them their own information in a way. It's not just making sure educators have it. We're doing a lousy job at that. We're doing a lousy job of communicating with parents, and we're doing an especially lousy job of empowering students. There is such a market for transforming the loads of data we have into actionable information that serves for decision making, and we have not nailed that yet. Nobody has nailed it.
Yeah, and I would just say is like, when I'm not struggling to fit into these pants, I like my data outputs to multiple things, right? So I get what Strava says, but I also get what Garmin says, right? And so the thing I would also say is that even if you're in the business of collecting data for a homeschool family, the device is probably incredibly relevant to a family who has a kid in a traditional district school as well, right? Because it's like the Ronald Reagan thing, trust but verify, right? So, one, I think there's an opportunity to give people more of what they say they want, including kids. Like, I always tell people, Instagram is a test, right? When someone is putting a picture on Instagram, that is a test, right? They're trying, a child is trying to find out what the world thinks about something they have done. And you can like or not like the metrics, but certainly there is a bias toward measurement there, right? And so maybe, and I think Secretary Guidera's point is really good, the prime consumer could be the kid, not even the adult, right? And there's a reason, there's a reason why the sugary, expensive cereal is at the bottom. Because so the kids can get it, right? If it was up top, if it was up top, it would be whatever. It would be nice to make measurement the sugary, expensive cereal for kids too.
Yeah.
And then I'll just add really quickly, because I think it's a kind of interesting phenomenon, and I think something that will grow as ESA programs grow, but there is kind of a rise of parent navigators in many states. This is true in Arizona, true in Idaho, I think will be true in Iowa. But Emily had mentioned some of them, Families Empowered, led by Conley Dipple, Love Your School, led by Jenny Clark, and actually in Florida, one of the most interesting aspects of the universal expansion was it actually wrote that into the law. TBD on exactly how that's going to work. The agency's got to figure that out. But it is a really interesting idea of taking an existing thing that already happens, which are some parents are more knowledgeable about local K-12 education options, and ESAs are actually kind of increasing that. And so I'm really excited, I think, to see how that continues to grow in different states.
Great. Okay, well, thank you everyone so much. Oh, Jeannie, did you have a question? Were you raising your hand? Okay, we'll end with Jeannie. One last question.
So here's a trouble that I would love your thoughts on. Most people are in the system was created 200 years ago, right? So they're not thinking about this. So how do you take what you're seeing and the need and actually translate that for policymakers who are voting stuff down?
What a question to end on, Michael.
Well, sorry, I'll jump in on that.
Yeah.
So I think there's a couple things. One is there is very clear polling data, because it's been asked numerous times, that Democrats, Republicans, and independents support education savings accounts. And when education savings accounts are actually fully explained to respondents before they answer the question, support for them actually goes up. So I think just across the board, there is support for it. And then I think number two, over time, support, I think, is dependent upon the number of parents who are utilizing these programs, which is why it's so important that for new programs, there is outreach and that people do sign up, because I think over time, that essentially develops kind of a cohort who's willing to support it.
And just to jump in quickly, we've done a lot of delegation fly-ins of lawmakers from other states to come see rural, remote, isolated communities, and to see and hear from their policy peers, but also to see the work in action, because Arizona is not alone for having these entrepreneurial leaders on the ground throughout the state, but especially areas that typically have been ignored, that aren't in the suburbs and the trendy cities. And so that's really been a game changer for those states who have deployed, whether it's Chamber of Commerce leaders, actual lawmakers who have sent cabinet members to us, who have sent other advocacy groups to help come and see the work in action. That's usually been where the light bulbs happened. So we're always happy to host.
Wait, I know they want us to stop, but one last thing on this.
We were told we are the last
I know, I'm sorry.
Bradley was like,
all
you're
right.
good, keep going.
But here's the thing, right? The most important thing is that this is not an exercise on paper. In like a month, 20% of the kids in America could be enrolled in a system of education finance like this. It's a different conversation, right? So to me, the most important thing is to move past, like policymakers, everybody, past the idea that we are discussing whether or not this should happen. It happened already. It's happening already, right? The horse is out of the barn and like running around and doing its thing. And I think there will be plenty of, the horse is doing its thing. I think there'll be plenty of opportunities for people to find examples and get on board from there.
And I'll just say where we do not have an appetite for choice and everyone is busy defending the status quo in Virginia, especially our General Assembly, we're going to use data. I'm a one-trick pony. So we're going to deliver now that we have incredible, now that we're going to have some of the most amazing data possible, we are now going to deliver that to every member of the General Assembly, not by school division, but by their electoral district. Because when I go down and testify in front of the General Assembly, members will say to me, how dare you tell us that there's not excellence in Virginia? And I want to say back, how dare you tell me that all students are being served in your district, because they're not. And so I think part of what we need to do is make the case and just confront people with the facts that that there is excellence in Virginia. There's just not excellence for every student, and we need to stop defending a system that is not working for every child.
And Jeannie, you know this obviously, but people are opting out already of the districts across the country where this is not working. Yeah, 1.3 million fewer, right, or something like that. And New York City lost a quarter of its population. And so that's a pressure as well. And those places can either innovate, or I think we'll continue to see the trend that we see that's pretty crystal clear.
I think with that, we will wrap it up. Thank you all so much for your time and attention to this panel. Appreciate it.